report. The flight of Apollo 10. Brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, as part of our continuing coverage of important news events. Reporting from the CBS News Apollo headquarters in New York, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
The two Apollo 10 spacecraft have now disappeared again behind the far side of the moon. Signal was lost to Earth just a few moments ago, and this is an important pass behind the moon, because this time, back there, where they have no communication with the Earth, Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan in the lunar module called Snoopy will be firing their engines to bring them back on this next time around to the near side of the moon to within 10 miles of the moon's surface. The exact distance, 9.3 miles, if all goes as they plan, just about 50,000 feet over the moon's surface. They should reach that point at 5:32 p.m. It's just a few miles, about 18 miles before the lunar landing site number 2, which is the preferred site for the landing now expected in July of Apollo 11. They just a few moments after that will be passing over the landing site at 5:36. About 4 minutes later, they'll be over the landing site, and then they will have begun their climb back out to an altitude of 212 miles as they get behind the moon on that revolution of the moon, their 14th. When they come around the next time, around 7:30 p.m. that will be, they will then come down to within 11 miles in that same point over the moon's surface, roughly. They fire their engines and go back to rendezvous and to redock with the command module at 10 o'clock tonight. The actual docking coming at 11:19 p.m. So far today, they've had some very high moments of this flight, no pun intended, as they're out there circling the moon. There have been some dramatic moments. Some of them have lasted for a couple of hours, some for just a few moments. There have been some moments of concern about the flight of Apollo 10 today. The first little hitch came right after Eugene Cernan, and then Tom Stafford climbed into the lunar module this morning after they awakened after a good night's sleep. They got down there and found that their communications back with John Young, left alone in the command module, weren't too good, nor with the ground. They finally got those straightened away, and communications have been nearly perfect ever since. And then at 1 o'clock this afternoon, as they were pressurizing the various parts of the spacecraft, they found that the 3-foot tunnel that joins the two spacecraft, they could not vent the pressure from it, and that gave them a major cause for concern. They finally decided that they could go ahead with the mission without venting the pressure completely there, getting it down to, just about 2/3 of what it should be, which would be 0. Instead of 5 pounds per square inch, they got it down to 3.5 pounds per square inch. But then a new problem developed. Because they could not depressurize that area, additional friction was set up in their docking configuration, their rings, and there was some fear that they might cause damage to those rings, which have to work when they come back and redock if they are to successfully redock and get back between the two modules. Well, they were behind the moon by the time the final test had to come. The strain did not become as great as the ground feared in Houston control. They'd given them some constraints, said if it got to a certain point, they could not go on with the mission. It did not get to that point. They separated as planned, and now they are separated. They made the pass around the moon in their separated configuration with the lunar module, Snoopy, just about 35, 40 feet out from the command module, Charlie Brown. They then separated even further and now have disappeared to the far side of the moon for this next important maneuver, which is scheduled to come at precisely, let me give you the moment, 4:35 p.m. Nelson Benton and Scott McLeod at Grumman Aircraft in Bethpage, Long Island, can tell us what's going on in that lunar module right now.
Walter, we're sort of looking forward to one of the things that will be going on after that descent orbit insertion. When the LEM goes down and gets down to that 50,000 foot point, one of the tests that has to be made is the LEM's altimeter. Anytime you are going to make a controlled landing on a surface, it's a good idea to know how high you are. Since normal altimeters are actuated by barometric pressure, and since there is no atmosphere on the moon, LEM 4 is carrying a small pod about the size of a double-loaf bread box right under the descent stage of the vehicle. It is a radar pod that looks around at the lunar surface. This does the looking, and it feeds what it sees into the cockpit. And Scott McLeod, how do you read what the radar is showing?
Well, Nelson, up here in the cockpit, what we have is an altitude rate on these two indicators, and also we have our forward and lateral velocity on this cross pointer. Primarily, we will get our best indications of those readings on the next flight, that's Apollo 11. This flight, Apollo 10, we will evaluate the radar, but really the proof of the pudding is the following flight.
Walter, the radar works much better. It actually sees very well down at about 18,000 feet, but it will work this time a bit like flying an aircraft over Pittsburgh, and the Washington Control Center can't see you very well, but it may just get some indication that you're there, and that's the kind of test we're having this time.
I can show you approximately how this all happens. As they come around the moon, this time they will incidentally be just a little bit from the command module at that point, which you see coming around the moon. They come around in this fashion, and then coming down slower and slower, they come down to this point just 10 miles above the moon's surface. Then they begin to come out again. They fire their engines so that this time they will go into a very high orbit out here, and eventually will be 350 miles away from the command module. They'll get out to their high point on the far side of the moon again, come sweeping down below the, down to the low point again as they come around this next time, and again 11 miles above the moon's surface. This time they fire to go back and rejoin the command module, and that rendezvous takes place on the far side of the moon also. All of the principal maneuvers of this dramatic part of the flight of Apollo 10 occur behind the moon, except for that dropping down to the moon's surface.
Simply stated, the purpose of the Apollo 10 flight is a final test of the men and machines required to do the lunar landing mission.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 10, you can tell the world that we have arrived.
They give us silver Snoopy for excellence awards. I wanted to honor the people that worked so hard, so we call him Snoopy. But he needed two names, so naturally the other one was Charlie Brown. Amazing what you see. One thing that always amazed me was the size of the boulders. There were these gigantic craters, and down at the bottom would be boulders, and up on the rim would be boulders. We're using a Hasselblad cameras, you have the highest resolution available then, and the radar was going. So radar map, photo maps, and visual maps. We're coming down, going upside down and backwards to retrograde. I heard the thruster start to fire. It just bang, bang, bang. So what I did, the station switches here, raised the thing, boom, station. And meanwhile, went to hard stops. But I got it back under control, and we made the maneuver. Came back to the perfect rendezvous. One thing people always ask, were you frightened? Were you scared? The answer is no. fighter pilots, test pilots, so we knew what risk was. We did everything we could to mitigate the risk, but there was a risk. And so we understood that. Well, we had a series of debriefings with them about, because we had all the procedures worked out. In fact, I went to Neil and says, buddy, here you are. Here's all the techniques, all the procedures down to the last 50,000 feet. And you take it there, hard descent on the surface, 50,000 feet up, it's all done. So he was following all the procedures. We made it back from the moon to the Earth in 42 hours. It was 24,791 miles an hour, or in Mach numbers, Mach 36. Or if you want to be precise scientifically, it was 0.0037% of the speed of light. So we were flat moving.
Apollo 10 would be a dress rehearsal for the lunar landing. There were still a number of systems, including landing radar that could only be checked out above the lunar surface. In addition, Apollo 8 had detected some strange gravitational fluxes during their 10 orbits. These too would be investigated. The LEM, nicknamed Snoopy, separated from Command Module Charlie Brown. Stafford and Cernan's orders were clear. Follow the flight path down towards the landing site in the Sea of Tranquility. Come within some 50,000 feet of lunar soil. Then release the descent stage and rocket back into orbit.
We did everything that needed to be done except the landing itself, which made, I think, life a little bit more comfortable for the Apollo 11 crew, because the big challenge then was from 47,000 feet down to the deck.
Hello, Houston, Houston, this is Snoopy. Right, Snoop, go ahead. We is going, we is down among them, Charlie. Roger, I hear you weaving your way up the freeway.
Well, knowing a little bit about astronauts, I think that the idea of making that landing certainly crossed their minds, but knowing how disciplined they were and how much discipline was in this entire flight test program, it was not conceivable that it was going to happen.
When we made 2 passes over the lunar surface on Apollo 10 with the lunar module, separated from our command module several, I don't know, tens or hundreds of miles away, on the second pass, we then simulated what would have to be done on the surface, where you separate the 2 stages, fire the ascent engine, and we're on our way to a rendezvous. And we did that with the abort guidance system rather than the primary guidance system, just to check out everything. We also checked out the landing radar on that mission and found out that it had been programmed improperly, and had that happened on Apollo 11, they would not have landed. So we found out some interesting things on Apollo 10.
The landing rehearsal was nearly complete. All that remained was to separate from the descent stage of the LEM and fly back to the command module. Stafford began resetting the controls, unaware that Cernan had done exactly the same thing.
And I had all the switches set, and Tom instinctively, as we will do, will reach over there and change the position of the guidance switch, because he knew it had to be changed to AGS. Well, I had already changed it to AGS. And so when it fired, it was on a primary guidance system, and the primary guidance system didn't know where to tell it to go. So we did separate, we spun out of control.
The thing was tumbling and rolling all over the place, and they were really in trouble, and there was quite a few expletives broadcast to the world audience before they got it back under control. It was a pretty crazy moment.
I remember seeing a lunar horizon go by in different directions about 8 times in some 15 seconds. Tom took it back from the computer, got it under control. We gave it back to the abort guidance system. We got the burn on time when we rendezvoused, and everything turned out all right.
It was later determined that the lander had come within 2 seconds of crashing into the lunar surface before Stafford and Cernan regained control. Despite the few unnerving seconds, Apollo 10 had cleared a pathway almost down to the lunar surface. Snoopy's mission was over. The next LEM to fly was reserved for Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. It would be called the Eagle.
Remember when I came back from Apollo 10 and I tried to impress you?
Yeah.
You know, Daddy's been to the
Been
moon, he
here,
flew Snoopy
done this.
closer, and
I
was
remember.
way out in the heavens where God lives, and I never forget it. You just stood and listened to me, and
Brought you
then
back down to earth.
all of a sudden it got quiet, and I had nothing else to say, and you looked up and say, Daddy, now that you've been to the moon and back, when are you going to take me camping?
Camping. We used to
Like
go camping.
you promised me.
That's right.
And you know what that brought home? All the times during that period of our life together that I couldn't take you camping, that I was gone. I was gone somewhere. I was gone and gone and gone and gone. It was a very selfish life on my part and on the part of all the guys.